Daring daylight escape Ray Lee Hempstead denied bail earlier this week after his arrest for manslaughter. Broke out the back windshield of a Balboa County Sheriff's Department cruiser and fled on foot.
Meeks and Johnson lost him. I think those are two guys you hired.
You hear that, honey? That's leadership. Way to stand up on your own 2 feet, Lamb, and say, hey, the buck stops there.
This video is sponsored by MUBI, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/skipintro. This is Veronica Mars, a TV show about the titular Veronica Mars, a high school student with a penchant for solving mysteries, moonlighting for her private investigator dad, taking cases from fellow classmates, and seeking truth for some crimes that have hit really close to home, all in between homework assignments.
This girl, she's our age, and she's a detective. She's also a cartoon.
The show ran from 2004 to 2007, before being revived by a Kickstarter campaign for a film in 2014, and for a 4th season on Hulu in 2019. Man, remember when studio executives revived shows rather than removing them from their streaming platform forever for tax purposes? Rest in peace, Westworld. I always thought you were overrated, and now I feel quite vindicated. The arc of history truly does bend towards justice. While Veronica Mars deals with solving crimes and mysteries, it isn't really what I'd call a cop show. Besides the high school teen romance hijinks, it doesn't follow the police or concern itself exclusively with arrests or violent crime. The police, when they do show up, are obstacles rather than support systems. They're lazy, often refusing to follow leads or, do their jobs.
This was more to steer you in the right direction than to, say, do your job for you. Actually, it was doing your job for you. Getting admissible evidence seems like the least you can do.
They don't care if they arrest the wrong person.
I don't care if Logan ain't the guy. America thinks he's guilty, and that's good enough for me.
They're blatantly corrupt, serving the interests of the rich and powerful.
What's going on here?
Stop and frisk. Some developer bought up all this, now our local police are running off the undesirables.
And to top it all off, they are mind-blowingly cruel. Our first introduction to the sheriff in the pilot episode is him laughing Veronica out of the station for trying to report that she'd been drugged and sexually assaulted at a high school party.
I've got not a shred of evidence to work with here, but that really doesn't matter to your family now, does it? Look at this. She cries.
Tell you what, Veronica Mars, why don't you go see the wizard? Ask for a little backbone.
In other words, Veronica Mars offers a rare portrayal of the police on TV. An accurate one.
You got a smart mouth, kid.
After all, police clearance rates for sexual assaults are terrible. According to the FBI, only 36 to 37% of rapes result in an arrest and the case being handed over to prosecutors. That's not a conviction, that's not the case even being tried, just handed over to the legal system. Plus, in 2022, there were at least 25,000 untested rape kits in law enforcement agencies across the country, which is probably an undercount considering those numbers are from only 30 states.
Still picking winners, huh, Veronica?
I told you. When I start picking losers, it's all you.
In this country, we love our cop shows. They make up about 60% of network primetime programming. Because this channel is somewhat critical of those cop shows, people are always asking me, well, what do you want out of these cop shows? You want them to just hate the police? You want them to just show every cop is bad? Yes. And I don't think that it's all that much to ask considering this teen drama from the mid-2000s did it. Just saying. This poor quality of policing isn't just aesthetic, though. It's what fundamentally motivates Veronica. Besides the police's unwillingness to investigate her assault, when we meet Veronica, she's still reeling from the murder of her best friend, Lily Kane. When Veronica's father, Keith, the then sheriff, suspects the most powerful man in town, he's promptly ousted. And a man is arrested who Veronica and Keith are pretty convinced is a patsy.
The fine people of Neptune gathered their pitchforks and torches, stormed the county commissioner's office, and ran Dad out of office.
Oh ho ho ho! If only it were that easy to remove a sheriff, but don't worry, we'll get there. But what's so interesting to me about Veronica Mars, and why we're talking about it today, is that while the show throws a lot of flack towards the police, it's still set up the same way as most police procedurals. Each episode has a case of the week, with Veronica doing familiar kinds of detective work, stakeouts, following leads, questioning persons of interest, and surveilling suspects. Where most crime dramas tend to focus on individuals turning to evil and the police officers who hold that thin blue line between civilization and some imagined barbarian horde, Veronica Mars bucks the trend, placing crime and policing inside a broader context of wealth inequality, corruption, and racial politics.
Today I'll talk about the socioeconomic conditions that lead preteens into a life of crime.
It's kind of like The Wire crossed with Chinatown if it starred Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
A girl, a teenager, and a private detective. I'm a triple threat.
Many of those cases of the week that Veronica investigates are not random acts of violence, but instead stem directly from the most foundational aspect of the show, its setting. Neptune, California, a town defined by inequality.
This is my school. If you go here, your parents are either millionaires or your parents work for millionaires. Neptune, California, a town without a middle class.
I mean, those are literally the very first lines in the entire series. That's how it starts. You fire it up, and that's the first thing you hear. This inequality is essential to the fabric of the town and the show in general. The rich kids, almost exclusively white, are called 09ers.
I don't know what an 09er is.
It's someone who lives in the prestigious 90909 zip code.
They are represented by the appropriately named Dick Casablancas and Logan Eccles, the son of a movie star.
You know, the glow of your father's wealth and celebrity may be enough to sustain you through high school, Mr. Eccles, but do you know what it will get you in the real world?
He's a high school English teacher.
At the bottom of the wealth totem pole is everyone else. Most notable among them being the PCHers, a Hispanic biker gang led by Eli Weevil Navarro, who frequently and violently clashes with Logan at school and really just everywhere. They're just fighting all the time.
All right, so who's gonna throw the first?
Class struggle. Veronica and her best friend Wallace aren't quite that poor, but they certainly feel the class crunch.
In a world where you can afford $3,000.
Oh, I'm so sick of not having money. I'd be the best rich person. Seriously, I'd be the perfect combination of frivolous and sensible. Money is so wasted on the wealthy.
Veronica Mars showcases the complicated reasons people end up outside the law, and shines a light onto the advantages afforded to the rich. Because, as it turns out, in reality, and this might shock you, but practically, the law doesn't apply to everyone equally. It blew my mind when I learned it too. It's in this wildly unfair world that Veronica's anti-authority attitude was forged, born from having been failed by authorities in her own assault and her best friend's murder, and steadily reinforced by the rampant injustices she sees all around her. It's kind of like how I started this copaganda series because of George Floyd, and now it's just the smell of frying bacon that keeps me going. Welcome to Copaganda, a series of videos exploring the portrayal of the police on television and how that portrayal has shaped our understanding of who the police are and what they should be. We've covered shows from across the spectrum, from The Wire to The Rookie to Paw Patrol to Blue Bloods.
What's Patrol doing?
Everything they can, which isn't a lot.
And what's that mean?
It means you can't use much force defending a cop accused of excessive force.
Operative word, accused.
Which used to mean something.
Look, if you or a loved one has been watching Blue Bloods, I just want you to know that there's absolutely nothing you can do. There's no hope. It's pure brain rot.
If he's using his authority to seduce a young cop, I can't just look the other way, right?
Not in this day and age.
Don't worry though, it was only the third most watched scripted show on TV last year. LOL. You know, there's a lot of talk about the opioid epidemic, but I'm the only one out here talking about the Blue Bloods epidemic. It's the silent, mustachioed killer. In this series, we've looked at a number of shows that point to issues with the police, from the corrupt cops of The Shield and We Own the City, to the way Brooklyn Nine-Nine points out the difficulty in holding police officers accountable. But those shows tend to uphold the basic system of policing, arguing for better personnel or training, rather than real structural change. So for all of the criticisms Veronica Mars throws at the police officers that patrol its episodes, is it any different? Is it just that familiar whitewashing, or does Veronica Mars offer a better way to do the police procedural, giving us the beats of our beloved cop shows while offering a different vision of what justice could look like? Veronica Mars stands out from other crime dramas in that every single cop we meet is either bad at their job or corrupt. Every single one of them. In season 4, with a serial bomber on the loose, we get this nice little synopsis of the history of Neptune law enforcement leadership.
Remember Mars 1? Fail. Lamb?
corrupt, dumb. Mars 2, evidence tampering. Lamb 2, corrupt, dumber. Hashtag sea sprite bombing.
A pizza guy said that? About me?
I mean, Veronica might be mad about it, but them's the facts. Let's go through the list, shall we? We've already met Sheriff Don Lamb, who, on top of being corrupt and cruel, is just plain bad at his job.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Despite an obsession with fitness and keeping it tight.
I run a tight ship, Keith.
And you look good doing it.
He runs such a loose, flabby operation that evidence is being stolen and tampered with directly under his nose all the time. So often, in fact, that there are department talking points for it.
Gotta hand it to you, Sachs. You stay on message like nobody's business. If not for the little perspiration problem, you'd make a great White House press secretary.
Lamb is easily duped into revealing facts of criminal investigations when his libido gets the best of him. Like in this scene, where Veronica prank phone calls him as the local hot news lady.
Informative.
Well, thank you, Sheriff. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
A fun scene that was recreated in the film with his brother, Dan Lamb.
This is Sheriff Dan Lamb.
Got a minute, Sheriff?
Nothing but time for you, Miss Martina Vasquez.
Dan is the replacement sheriff in the 2014 film, and is so blatantly evil that Don almost looks good in comparison.
So this new Sheriff Lamb, he is big of a clown as his little brother?
Bigger, lazy, and barely competent like his brother, more venal and corrupt.
Under Dan's leadership, the sheriff's department has adopted a stop and frisk policy that deputies readily admit is just about fishing for reasons to arrest someone.
So what'd you get those two crime lords for? Embezzlement? Human trafficking?
I don't know yet. I'm sure we'll figure something out.
They also plant evidence.
My 11th client in the past 6 months claiming that the sheriff's department has planted contraband on them.
And while the movie ends before this particular plotline is fully resolved, it seems like the department's corruption has put them in touch with the Fitzpatrick crime family. By the 4th season, Neptune has incorporated into a city with a police chief, Marsha Langdon. Just to make sure we know that diversity is not the problem with the police, she continues the long history of Neptune law enforcement incompetence, handling evidence without gloves.
Let me see that.
Yeah, you should probably wear gloves.
And refusing to cooperate with the FBI when they try to assist with the serial bomber investigation.
She is slow walking every piece of evidence. Got nothing on the first 2 bombs. I never thought I'd say this, but I kind of miss Sheriff Lamb.
Yeah, he was dumb and easy to manipulate, I'll give him that.
And it's not just leadership. There's this random undercover ATF agent in the first season who can't solve his case, so he plants evidence on a suspect. We find out that Wallace's biological and absent father was a cop working narcotics. Why has it taken him 17 years to track Wallace down?
But then he went undercover on some case that he said would make his career. And soon he got so deep into it, he had me fooled. Unless coming home high was a part of the job, unless stashing heroin and guns under my bed was all in the line of duty.
I hear you, Mrs. Fennell, but in just the last year, there was this officer selling drugs from his cruiser in Maine. The Riverside Sheriff's Department sold 60 pounds of meth to a dealer and let them get away. And there was the San Jose Police Union executive running a massive fentanyl operation out of her home. So what I'm saying is maybe it is part of the job. I don't know.
Hey. Is there anybody you don't think is corrupt deep down?
On Veronica Mars, even good cops suck at their jobs. Deputy Sachs, while uncomfortable with the corruption around him, remains complicit for the entire series, and is consistently shown to be jumpy and not that bright. Leo D'Amato is another good cop who is easily manipulated by Veronica, a high school junior he dates as a deputy, which is iffy. So iffy that they had to issue a retraction in the film 10 years later.
We used to make out, which was a little bit sketchy because you worked at the sheriff's department and I was still in high school.
It is really wild how many explicitly underage relationships are portrayed as okay in the early 2000s. Just absolutely bananas. Here's a minor spoiler, but as a deputy, Leo steals crucial evidence from the sheriff's department and sells it. The evidence is then destroyed, which leads to huge ramifications in court, and he's fired. Don't worry though, despite the fact that it was Keith who caught him, when Keith becomes sheriff again briefly at the end of season 3, he hires Leo back immediately.
We say, Leo. Feel like getting back in?
Good job, Keith. And by season 4, Leo's risen all the way to the FBI, although his inclusion is mostly used to demonstrate the absolute ineptitude of his agency on the show.
I want you to go pick up Lassiter in LA, and he's gotta be the guy.
Okay, I guess we're hitting the road to go pick up the guy that nobody in this room believes is guilty.
And of course, to do some age-appropriate flirting with Veronica. Ow, ow. But what about Keith? Keith! Oh, Keith. What about Keith? Keith is the moral compass and Veronica's ethical role model. The entire show basically has a what would Keith do bracelet strapped to its wrist.
How does it feel to be a hero?
My dad's the hero. Go talk to him.
But his stints as sheriff are hardly spotless. Before the series begins, he goes doggedly after Jake Kane, a Bill Gates-style figure in Neptune, for the murder of his daughter Lily, with pretty flimsy evidence.
What about your theory? Jake Kane murders his own daughter. We've got an eyewitness and phone records that have him nowhere near the house. And all the Kanes, in fact, were accounted for at the time of the murder. What's that? Nothing to say to that, right?
While there is certainly more than meets the eye to this case, and at the risk of a very minor spoiler, Keith is wrong. He's wrong. He was wrong, and he let his personal grudge against Jake Kane for being the high school sweetheart of his wife influence him. Keith was wrong. When Keith ultimately becomes sheriff again towards the end of season 3, which palpably feels like the writers trying desperately to breathe new life into a show on the verge of cancellation, he doesn't exactly do a good job. He spends his time trying to crack down on fake IDs in college bars, blaming both the creators of the fake IDs and the bartenders when a drunk 19-year-old walks into traffic.
A 19-year-old kid was drinking at a bar called The Break tonight with a gumball level ID. He stumbled out and a car hit him. Looks like he'll never walk again.
He spends like 5 episodes on this problem, which seems like a weird thing to fixate on when just a few weeks ago there was a serial rapist stalking frat parties where, they don't ID anyways. Plus, it's not like 21-year-olds can't also get drunk and walk into traffic. It's just a weird set of priorities, in my opinion. Later, when Veronica is entangled in a legal mess, he tampers with evidence too, which is something you shouldn't do if you are a law enforcement officer. Not to say that cops don't do it. They absolutely do. I literally just put police evidence tampering into Google News results, and oh boy, here's a story from within the last month. Don't worry though, I'm sure he's just a bad apple. A bad apple police chief. Chief of the bad apples. Chief bad apple. A police chief. Conversely, in a real flip of the Law & Order script, the only lawyer we ever really meet on the show is Cliff McCormick, a public defender after Saul Goodman's heart.
While my client did have relations with the man in question, no money changed hands.
Really?
The John was fresh from a tour in Afghanistan, and Ms. Carlisle has a veterans fly free policy. My client has saluted many vets, men, women, from both Iraq wars, Vietnam, Korea, even an intrepid World War II vet. They really are the greatest generation.
The 4th season portrays the prison of Chino as not a place for rehabilitation, but where criminal networking can occur, implying correctly that prisons do very little to prevent crime and don't make us much safer. Veronica doesn't just pay lip service to anti-cop attitudes. She goes to great lengths to not only elude the powers that be, but actively undermine them, sometimes committing legitimate felonies in the process. She goes out of her way to humiliate the sheriff's department.
All right, what you're gonna see here are the 2 defendants over there. They enter, and...
Sheriff Lamb, is this one of your officers? Is this how you run your department?
She makes good use of her handy-dandy taser, and she's something of a breaking and entering connoisseur. This is all to say, Veronica Mars is not exactly a safe space for thin blue liners.
You said you were in Mexico the day of Lily's murder. Why?
How many episodes of NYPD Blue did you have to watch to get the finger tapping down?
And what's more, Veronica Mars has picked the absolute best targets for their policing criticisms. Setting aside the 4th season, Neptune isn't governed by a traditional police department. It's under the protection of the sheriff's department. And sheriffs, well, they're just the absolute fucking worst. Sheriff's departments aren't your typical police, and there are a number of differences. First, and most prominently, sheriffs, unlike police chiefs, aren't appointed by a mayor, but instead are directly elected by the county. Democracy is good, and if you're like me, you probably think that electing a sheriff sounds like a good idea. After all, democratic control of law enforcement seems pretty swell. We want the police to be accountable to the public, and what better way than holding a referendum on them every few years, right? What's wrong with that? Well, in practice, there's a lot wrong with that. First off, it means that sheriffs are difficult to remove from office if they do something egregious, since there's no mayor or city council to remove them. As Jim Bierman, president of the Police Foundation, explains, police chiefs run for their office every day, in the sense that they're at-will employees. You can't really fire a sheriff. For example, last year, a Vermont sheriff, despite being charged and arrested for sexual assault, refused to resign, stating, "I'm still the sheriff." Luckily, he was up for re-election that same year and decided not to run for a third term, but that is hardly the norm. Much more likely is the case of Eddie Scott, a Mississippi sheriff who has been accused of sexual assault repeatedly over the course of his decade in office. Sheriffs are incredibly difficult to remove through elections because they benefit from a huge incumbency advantage, and more often than not, run unopposed. According to research from Michael Zarub at Harvard in 2019, incumbents are pervasive in sheriff elections, with 73% of races featuring an incumbent running for re-election. Conditional on running, about 90% of incumbents win re-election. This incumbency advantage is larger than any other office, and is a major factor in explaining why the average tenure of elected sheriffs is nearly 11 years, compared to police chiefs who last an average of just 2.5 to 3 years, according to the Major Cities Chiefs Association. Say Major Cities Chiefs Association 3 times fast. It's hard. Trust me. That must be because they're doing such a great job, right? That's why nobody's challenging them? Because they're just so doggone popular, right? No. Often, when sheriffs are challenged in elections, it's by deputies, people who have experience with the department and law enforcement. But sheriffs hold a ridiculous amount of power to keep subordinates in line, because across the country, for some godforsaken reason, sheriffs are legally allowed to fire deputies for political speech. And there are dozens of examples of this. In 2019 in Loudoun County, Virginia, Mark McCaffrey was let go after supporting a different candidate for sheriff in the Republican primary. He sued, but the court decided in favor of the sheriff. In North Carolina in 2010, Sheriff Daniel Bailey fired deputies who didn't donate to his campaign. The court ruled in his favor as well. In 2015 in Missouri, Sheriff Brad Cole fired 6 deputies for supporting one of his opponents. The 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals found that the position of Missouri deputies hold policy-making positions for which political loyalty is necessary. In South Dakota in 2018, a deputy was fired precisely 1 minute after the polls closed when he ran against his boss, the sheriff. Although he won the election, his firing left his family without health insurance for months before his swearing in. And I think that Veronica Mars depicts the corruption and issues of sheriff elections pretty well. Don Lamb uses his power as sheriff to blackmail donations out of his constituency.
Actually, I was thinking you might purchase more like 1,000 tickets.
Oh, and if you could MC the Bachelor auction, that would be great.
That's a lot of money, Sheriff.
Yeah, that's $10,000.
And Deputy Sachs is terrified of speaking out against either Lamb sheriff, for fear of retaliation. Elections can also be complicated for law enforcement more generally. A 2015 analysis from the Brennan Center found that in re-election years, judges are more likely to impose longer sentences, affirm death sentences, and even override life sentences to impose death. And I think this is also depicted quite well in Veronica Mars, as every time Keith runs for office, he's confronted with some ridiculous fear-mongering about crime, violence, and immigration.
You know what else bugs me? Gang violence bugs me. Illegal immigration bugs me. Drug trafficking bugs me. Street racing bugs me. But come election day, I am confident that the voters of Balboa County will do what is best and put the exterminator back in office.
Know what laws I plan to enforce? The important ones, like murder and terrorism. These aren't just the subjects of our favorite movies and TV shows. These are the things that threaten us here and now.
So, if incumbents are impossible to unseat and you can't fire them, there's not all that much accountability or oversight. California courts have even determined that the legislature can't impose term limits on sheriffs. And this all gives sheriffs the framework to do some wildly corrupt things. In 2015, a Virginia sheriff fired a deputy who was conducting an internal affairs investigation. According to a Roanoke Times article about the case, the deputy had found widespread corruption. Misrepresentations had been made to the county commonwealth's attorney office, incident reports had been altered, and a deputy's brother who had been used as a confidential informant. When the deputy reported it to the sheriff, he was fired, and the state Supreme Court said that was A-OK. From 2016 to 2020, Pembina Pipeline Corporation, a Canadian fossil fuel company, poured over $2 million into the Coos County Sheriff's Office to purchase riot control equipment, monitor the activities of Jordan Cove opponents, and coordinate intelligence gathering operations with private security companies that also work for Pembina. In other words, the company bought the Sheriff's Department gear specifically to subdue and monitor any activists who might be protesting future developments. I'm not sure which part is more offensive. That the Sheriff's Department was bought, that it was bought for just $2 million over 40 years, or that it was bought by fucking Canadians. Have some self-respect.
What do you expect? They're Canadian.
Hey, Terrence, Philip. Like you're the bare naked ladies?
Shh, I think they might be.
Alabama Sheriff Todd Entrikin pocketed more than $750,000 from a fund that was meant to feed inmates. And Massachusetts Sheriff Thomas Hodgson partnered with Securus Technologies to charge inmates $5 for 10-minute phone calls, raising over $1 million.
It's the Neptune way, protecting and serving the highest bidder.
Sheriffs have also used their unmatched authority to choose which laws they like, with many refusing to enforce COVID restrictions during the pandemic, which is definitely over and not at all still affecting millions of lives, federal gun laws, and discrimination laws. Former Sheriff Richard Mack spoke in Utah about how elected officials have failed at their jobs and that it's up to sheriffs to deny same-sex marriage, saying, quote, "The people of Utah have rights too, not just the homosexuals. The homosexuals are shoving their agenda down our throats." Yeesh. Good thing that guy is a former sheriff, right? Oh wait, I'm seeing now that he's actually the founder and leader of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which claims at least 10% of sheriffs nationwide as card-carrying members. And he's also on the board of directors of the Oath Keepers, who orchestrated January 6th. Cool guy. Cool job being a sheriff. Seems like you can literally do anything. Mack and his organization promote the idea of constitutional sheriffs, the far-right belief that county sheriffs have powers given to them by the Constitution that supersede all other authorities, even federal ones. In 2020, Mack's organization partnered with a Texas nonprofit called Trust the Vote, turning their attention to voter fraud and election meddling. Again, 10% of sheriffs in this country are card-carrying members of that organization. It's kind of mind-blowing that we started here thinking, hey, maybe elections could be good and provide a check on the power of the police. And now we're here and they're literally trying to overturn elections. But here we are. And because of all of that, I'm glad Veronica Mars makes Don Lamb the douchiest piece of shit on the show, exposing the office for the sham that it is. Of course, it is implied repeatedly that Keith was a good sheriff, a just sheriff.
Sheriff Mars, you always had my vote.
But like I pointed out earlier, he was just kind of less bad. Keith does far more to hold the department accountable as an ordinary citizen than he ever does from the inside.
Unless you want to be a YouTube star by tomorrow morning, you're gonna let those boys go now.
Or I can shove that phone right up your ass.
Well, we've seen how tough you are with boys. Maybe this is the day you find out how you do with a full-grown man.
Frankly, it feels rare to see the police portrayed in such a consistently negative light, the way Veronica Mars does. There are no good apples to be found. So where did Veronica Mars get this different dynamic? Certainly, it's not a show following the steps of Dragnet or NYPD Blue or Blue Bloods. Blue Bloods can't hurt you. Blue Bloods can't hurt you. Blue Bloods can't hurt you. Blue Bloods. So back in the first episode of this series, I gave you a little history of copaganda on TV, and a lot of it started with Dragnet.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true.
But it isn't the whole picture. You see, history is complicated, and there are a lot of factors that go into things. Honestly, it's really fucking annoying. Veronica Mars isn't really a cop show. It doesn't follow in the footsteps of police procedurals, but instead more in the tradition of film noir, which is kind of like the mother of the police procedural, but in a Rosemary's Baby sense.
What have you done to it? What have you done to its eyes?
Now, film noir is a pretty difficult thing to define, and academics have been arguing about it for fucking decades. It's a term that wasn't used at the time, but has been used more retrospectively to define a specific aesthetic of crime films from the 1930s through 50s. And Veronica Mars clearly taps into those aesthetics. Besides following around a hard-boiled detective based out of a downtown office with Venetian blinds shot in Dutch angles, it takes place in a corrupt world and follows a protagonist protagonist who is obsessed with uncovering the truth no matter the cost.
The one big downside of justice. It feels good, but it doesn't change anything.
Film noir has always had an interesting relationship with both the police and authority at large. Many crime films in the 1930s and 40s highlighted corrupt police, or at the very least, a system that was indifferent and cruel, like in The Blue Dahlia, where a man is falsely accused of killing his wife and becomes a fugitive.
It all blows up in your face sometimes, doesn't it?
What does?
Whatever you're doing, wherever you're going.
As media scholar Dennis Bro describes it, films noir tend to highlight the relationship between individuals and the law as a social one. Film noir represents the transformation of the crime film. Beginning as an undercurrent during the war and becoming dominant immediately after it, the male or female lead character in noir films, often through no fault of their own, is driven outside the law. The main action of the film surrounds the law's pursuit of that character and his or her attempt to evade the law while searching for the actual criminal. That does sound familiar, doesn't it?
Got too many questions swirling around in my head to wait until he's willing to share. These questions need answers. That's what I do.
Now, this is not to say that all noir films fall into the analysis that I'm going to be making here. Film noir is not a monolith, and I'm simplifying it quite a bit for the sake of time. But this was a dominant trope in American cinema. According to Bro, from 1945 to 1950, 40% of crime films featured what he calls the sympathetic fugitive, a character failed by the legal system and pushed outside the bounds of the law unjustly. It was basically the MCU of the late 1940s. The films in this lineage focused on the shaky relationship between justice and police. Pushing main characters outside the bounds of the law while remaining sympathetic made them what historian Eric Hobsbawm coined social bandits. His theory was that peasant outlaws might have been regarded as criminals by the state and ruling class, but that they were heralded as heroes by those within their class, the lower class. In the words of Hobsbawm, social bandits, quote, right wrongs, they correct and avenge cases of injustice, and in doing so, apply a more general criterion of just and fair relations between men in general, and especially between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak. Think Robin Hood.
We rob from the rich and give to the poor, that's right!
Hobsbawm was a historian, and the historical accuracy of his theory is debatable. I'm not going to get into it. But the concept has a rich tradition in storytelling, one that was embodied in many films noir and in Veronica Mars. Veronica is a social bandit. She defies the authority of school and law enforcement authorities while challenging the income inequality and social distinctions around her. She may frequently break the law, but in the words of academic Melissa Sartori, the acts of bandits are criminal but are shaped by the actions of their enemies. These enemies are enemies of the people. Therefore, the crimes committed against them by bandits are viewed as punishments given to deserving victims. While Veronica can, in some ways, engage in lawbreaking that we'd call out in corrupt cops, this power dynamic is everything. In past episodes of Copaganda, we've discussed ends justify the means cops, specifically in my episode about The Shield. Those police officers wield the weight of the state on their side. If Vic Mackey breaks into your house and threatens to throw you out a window, there's not really all that much you can do. He's insulated by the power of the state. His violence is not only accepted, but defended.
I need you.
He hit me, son! You're the police!
Veronica wields no such power. She does not have the power to arrest people or throw them in prison. While she does tase people regularly, she does not enjoy the same protections that police officers do when they do it. She has no qualified immunity, no legal protection of probable cause or reasonable suspicion. If she gets caught doing something wrong, she can and will be arrested for it.
Yo, Pops, check it out. This girl ain't gonna be nobody's bitch, you better recognize.
What's that on your arm?
I've had some free time.
She is not operating on behalf of the state or for the rich and powerful. She stands in stark opposition to both. That's not to say that it's okay to tase people.
Your body slamming, that's like 50 points right there. And this might sound like a weird question, but you're not an orphan, are you?
Okay, that guy had it coming. But that's not to say that it's a morally righteous thing to do, only to highlight the way power changes context. And in the 1940s, this idea of contextual crime wasn't just popular, it was dominant. The reason this idea was so dominant at the time has a lot to do with the fact that from August 1945 to June 1946, America was embroiled in the largest and most concentrated strike period in the country's history. In the fallout of World War II, auto workers, steel workers, coal miners, meat packers, and film crews all went on strike, demanding pay to keep up with inflation and to work better hours. Nearly 5 million Americans struck during this time period. Workers of the world, unite! This freaked authorities the freak out. When Republicans took control of Congress in 1947, they immediately responded with the Taft-Hartley Act. Here's a lawyer from the 5 to 4 podcast explaining how that law works.
Probably the foremost is the passage in 1947 of the Taft-Hartley Act, which was designed from bottom to top to limit union power. They get it past Truman's veto, and the law made an assortment of union activity illegal, including certain types of strikes. That's why, like, wildcat strikes, for example, are not legal, and paved the way for right-to-work laws. Fun bit of trivia, also forced union leaders to sign affidavits saying that they weren't communists.
Fun.
So great piece of legislation. Yeah.
Another fun bit of trivia, Taft-Hartley is still on the books. It's the law of the land. So thanks for that, Joe Biden, most pro-labor president, or whatever you're going by these days. I mean, Harry Truman was out there saying that it needed to be repealed, but I don't hear any Democrats saying that today. There was a concerted effort to align labor movements with the growing fear of the Soviet Union, which led to a number of hearings at HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, where they would drag suspected communists in and grill them. You know, people think that cancel culture is a problem these days, but let me tell you, they ain't got nothing on HUAC. And the combination between active labor unions asking for more and the Red Scare created a perfect storm for Hollywood executives to create a blacklist, purging suspected communists and really just crushing the labor movement that was giving them trouble. As Larry Sepler, the author of the book The Hollywood Motion Picture Blacklist 75 years later, wrote in Jacobin, the dragnet, oh hey look, there's that fun little word, affected not just communists or even radicals, but left-leaning figures of all stripes. Liberals feared retribution should their scripts be read as too progressive. One said he was always looking over his shoulder as he sat at his typewriter. Liberals who had been politically active, like Edward G. Robinson, had to turn cartwheels to absolve themselves of their past deeds. Over 336 names appeared on a blacklist in some place or another, including actors, screenwriters, and other creatives. Between the blacklist and HUAC, there was a huge chilling effect on liberal or lefty ideas. Ideas like, maybe some criminals aren't evil. And in the next decade, many film noir elements morphed into what we now know as the police procedural. From Bro Again, studios rolled back the figure of the sympathetic fugitive, splitting it in two. Most dominant was the new lead character of the cop or criminal investigator in a series of films called the police procedural. Instead of being positioned outside the law with the fugitive, the audience moved to the front seat of the squad car, tracking down the fugitive. Traces of working-class manners and modes of thought persisted and were positively validated in Hollywood in the figure of the cop. The cop, and only the cop, worried about how much money he was making or how he was going to support his family. Yeah, that's how we get the entire police are working class trope, a bastardization of film noir. This is all to say that Dragnet and the copaganda we all know today didn't just emerge from the ether of the conservative 1950s, that it's a simple output from the free marketplace of ideas, and this was just the way people thought back then. We can see from film noir that there were more progressive ways of viewing crime and policing, and that the pivot to the police procedural as we know it today takes place in a larger, intentional backlash to labor in the 1940s and 50s, and a purging of ideas that had even a sniff of class solidarity in them. It's from that explicitly conservative foundation that the conventions and norms of cop shows were developed. To go back to our Rosemary's Baby example, it is truly like an evil cabal defiled film noir in order to create conservative propaganda. Spooky season! Veronica Mars goes back to the source, opting for the attitudes and aesthetics of film noir, untethering justice and police from each other, and understanding the social context under which law is defined and enforced. The resentment Veronica Mars has for the rich ruling class of Neptune, the 09ers, is palpable.
It's class warfare, the haves versus the have-nots. The rich kids, they run things around here. They're the minority and they're corrupt. They get away with murder.
Hey, give him hell, Wanda.
You give him hell, Rodney.
Before the events of the series, Veronica used to be one of the 09ers, because her dad was the sheriff.
My dad didn't own his own airline like John Enbaum's or serve as ambassador to Belgium like Shelley Pomeroy's. But my dad used to be the sheriff, and that had a certain cachet.
It's a nice subtle nod to the close relationship between wealth and policing. While Veronica is close with several 09ers, including a really clever gender-bendy inverse femme fatale relationship with Logan Echolls, Veronica exists more in between. She's lower middle class and knows how to navigate the PCHers, but she's also white and able to fit in with the 09ers. The racial component of wealth inequality and the justice system is also on full display throughout Veronica Mars. Conflicts between the 09ers and PCHers often mix the wealth dynamic with explicit racism.
You've been to my house a bunch, right?
Yep.
It's nice, right? It's clean, well kept. Yeah, it's because Weevil's grandma keeps it that way. She is a good little worker, your grandma. Yeah, spick and span.
Yes, that is indeed Paris Hilton, just so you know exactly what kind of image the 09ers are going for. Whenever a crime is committed, the racial bias of the police is on full display, suspecting Weevil of any and every crime that arises.
Yeah, it was me behind the grassy knoll, too.
In Season 2, after the death of Weevil's friend Felix, for which most suspect Logan Echolls, Logan is able to easily clear his name in court, leaving the PCHers violent and angry without a course for justice.
Logan's high-priced lawyers crushed the PCHers who testified against Logan in the preliminary hearing. The DA decided he didn't have enough evidence to convict, so 6 weeks after he was arrested, Logan walked. And the town went crazy. Another rich kid getting off scot-free.
It ends up that Logan was not the perpetrator, and he and Weevil team up to catch the real killer. But it's a dynamic that reproduces itself over and over. Keith sometimes scoffs at Veronica's friendship with Weevil.
Do I need to recap my concerned dad lectures? No running with scissors, no candy from strangers, no smartening up the local criminal element.
In Season 2, Veronica is chosen for jury duty in a case between two 09ers who are charged with assaulting a Hispanic sex worker.
I'll never, ever send two boys from good families to jail on the word of that Mexican whore.
In true 12 Angry Men style, Veronica is able to convince the jury to convict the 09ers, but only because the final juror is so sure that these young wealthy boys will win in appeal. And he's probably right.
Those boys will appeal and they'll win. I'll sleep with visions of sugar plums, trusting their fate in a jury that doesn't kowtow to a high school cheerleader.
We see the complexity of crime most prominently in Weevil. He is certainly involved in gang activity, and we watch him carry out a number of crimes, some of which are pretty bad. But the show spends time and energy explaining the context that drives him to gang life, and depicts the difficulties he has in moving past it. Weevil is shown repeatedly to care deeply for his family, supporting his grandmother and extended family financially. After high school, he struggles to find a job that will keep him out of his biker gang, since most employers use his legal status to mistreat him and only see him as a criminal.
No lip. Work. Or it's back to Chino.
Do you know anybody else who's hiring ex-cons? Because if I don't get a job in a week, I'm going back to the joint.
By the time we reach the events of the film, almost a decade after the first run of the series, Weevil has moved on from gang life, starting a family and settling down. However, when he tries to help a rich white lady being harassed by the modern PCHers, she shoots him. She is Celeste Kane, wife of billionaire Jake Kane, and when the sheriff's deputies show up, they plant a gun on Weevil just to add insult to injury.
Then she says Mr. Navarro approached her car, rapped on the window with a Beretta, and said time to party. That's when she fired.
Please, get this case dismissed before anybody believes the words time to party came out of my mouth.
We learn in the 4th season that Cliff and Keith put together a case against the sheriff's department for Weevil, but that Weevil had to settle behind their backs.
I had a wife and a daughter to think about. I don't live on Cherry Tree Lane, V. I needed the money. Does that make me a criminal?
By Season 4, Weevil has fully returned to gang work, but he's still providing for his family, doing the best he can to provide them with a steady source of income.
Your boys, you're doing grunt work for the people who want to destroy this town.
You know, it must be nice to have choices, Veronica.
Likewise, even Logan's bullying and violence are explored through social context. He too is reeling from Lily Kane's death. She was his girlfriend, and he's had an emotionally and physically abusive relationship with his father since childhood. That doesn't excuse his actions by any means, but it does provide context to them. And his identifying of those outside forces are a big part of his character arc, as he grows up and goes to therapy. The majority of the show's largest crimes aren't perpetrated by the poor. Time and time again, we see that the real villains come from the ruling class. If you don't want any big stuff spoiled, click ahead to the timecode that's on your screen now. Lily Kane was murdered when she threatened to expose the underage relationship movie star Aaron Eccles had with her.
Well, now you can just watch the tapes on Access Hollywood along with the rest of America.
The serial rapist on campus is a rich kid who just doesn't like having to work for the sex he feels entitled to.
I mean, if I'd met you in a bar or at a party, I would have had you back here and on your back in an hour. But that's an hour of my life I would have never had back.
In the 4th season, Big Dick Casablancas orchestrates a number of bombings so that he can buy and develop beachfront property into luxury condos at low cost.
Yeah, well, that would have been overpaying, and I never overpay. The bomb was supposed to go off in the middle of the night. It was just supposed to be a warning to Saul Ross, but, well, shit happens.
To top it off, Big Dick and Aaron never even suffer legal consequences for their crimes, meeting their ends more extrajudicially. But this isn't as simple as rich people bad. These crimes are on the flip side of the same coin as Weevil's, another downstream effect of the same inequality and class anxiety. The rigid class hierarchy of Neptune doesn't just exist to punish the poor, but to threaten the rich by showing them how far they could fall.
We're picturing jail time, lost futures, lost fortunes.
As critic Alyssa Rosenberg writes in her review of the 2014 film, it's a stinging reminder that the wealthy and powerful don't just do bad things because they're reckless with other people's lives. Sometimes they commit crimes because they have an awful lot to protect. Veronica Mars points explicitly to the power dynamics at work in the legal system. In the film, Sheriff Dan Lamb isn't vulnerable in his upcoming election because of the evidence he's been planting or the gangs he's been working with. He's vulnerable because he was caught on camera threatening corruption against Logan Eccles, who is famous enough that the video makes TMZ.
You think that a sheriff is squirming here? You should check out the TMZ Live exclusive video we got from the private investigator working for Logan Eccles. I don't care if Logan ain't the guy.
The point that Veronica Mars drives home is that ideas like law and crime exist within social contexts. They aren't necessarily the same as truth or justice, which brings us all the way back to where we started. Is Veronica Mars a template for anti-copaganda? Now, for as much as I've praised Veronica Mars in this video, it's not without its shortcomings. While I focused on how Keith was not a good sheriff, the show continually returns to the idea that the sheriff's department would be better if he was just put in charge again.
You want to protect me? Run for sheriff.
Likewise, Veronica straight up acts like a cop from time to time, and especially in the reboot season.
I've sent men to jail, and I've taken satisfaction from it. Always.
She does this really gross thing where she presses charges against the PCHer in order to get him to talk to her, even when he makes it very clear that he's in extreme danger if he does so.
I'm putting you in an impossible situation. If you don't give me satisfactory answers to my questions, I have the power to put you in Chino where people are waiting to kill you.
And if I tell you what you want to know, I'm just as dead.
She responds by telling him that $600 should be enough to start over somewhere else, which... what?
I mean, it's not a fortune, but it'll get you far away from here.
Also, Cliff, what the fuck are you doing, buddy? You are this man's defense attorney. It is wildly unethical to assist someone threatening him explicitly with death. Bad Veronica, bad Cliff. And this all has downstream consequences for that PCHer's family.
Weren't you worried about him going to prison and getting shot? He's safe now. You're welcome.
He's his family's main earner. His mom's been on my ass about lost income ever since he disappeared.
Veronica's general brand of justice is also pretty policey, focusing on vengeance and punishing evildoers as a stand-in for making things right.
Here's what you do. You get tough. You get even.
About half the time, Veronica's cases end up in police hands anyways, funneling them into the same system that the show rails against, just with Veronica having done the police's work for them. This is, after all, a crime drama, and in our society, the police are really the only recourse afforded to us when crime occurs. At the end of season 3, Veronica was lined up to join the FBI. She has an internship and everything. However, in the film, we learn that she went to law school instead, in what feels like a pretty explicit rebuke of policing. But she doesn't use that degree to become a defense attorney or anything like that. Perhaps that's because she'd be disbarred immediately, but it is odd to see her not using a tool at her disposal that could really help people navigate our unjust system, especially since that's what she and Keith have done in the past.
I wake up every day trying to figure out a way to take care of my people. But you've got degrees from Stanford and Columbia that you don't even use. You'd rather stay in this town that you say you hate, tasing teenagers and making them wet their pants.
That's because, for Veronica, protecting or defending people is a secondary priority, behind exposing the truth.
I'm sure she didn't do it. But if she did, I'm asking you to let it go.
You know I can't do that.
Well, why does it have to be about you all the time? Look, Jackie's right about one thing. It's your world. I just live in it.
It's a central tension for Veronica that the show attempts to grapple with repeatedly. I think that in the most radical ways, Veronica Mars does fall short. It doesn't imagine a new pathway for justice or any kind of substitute for retribution. Even in the most generous readings, private investigators aren't really a feasible alternative to the police, as they also, clearly, would serve the rich and powerful. Keith and Veronica frequently take work from rich people they don't particularly care for, because they gotta pay the bills. Across town, the other private investigator of Neptune, Vinny Van Lowe, doesn't even consider pro bono cases. He's in it for whoever will pay him the most money.
Keith, I am bound by the exact same ethical codes you are. I was pulling your leg. I had you though.
With regard to racial politics, Veronica can often come across as a white savior, thinking that she knows how best to help the PCHers better than they could possibly know for themselves. I don't think the show ever really substantially challenges the idea of Veronica knows best, since Veronica is almost always right.
Veronica Mars. The I told you so I'm gonna be hearing from her.
But I do think that it tries to address the privileges afforded to her by being white. At the beginning of season 2, Veronica has been readmitted to the 09er clique due to a new boyfriend, and she stopped being a private investigator because, well, frankly, it's easy for her to turn a blind eye now.
You went and landed yourself some rich boyfriend. And last year was just some big old act for you. You gotta pick sides in this town these days. You picked yours.
Again, in the film, Veronica is on the verge of joining a corporate law firm, a way to escape Neptune forever with a nice golden parachute.
Our clients here at Truman Mann are primarily Fortune 500 companies. Our job is to make sure that frivolous lawsuits disappear before they ever reach the courtroom.
It'd be so easy for her to forget about the injustice of her hometown, but in the end, she doesn't. She decides to return to Neptune and continue fighting.
I convinced myself winning meant getting out. But in what world do you get to leave the ring and declare victory?
It might be a losing war, and there might not be all that much she can do on her own, but she's going to try, because she believes in doing what you can.
No, it's not that simple.
Yeah, it is. The hero is the one that stays, and the villain is the one that splits.
Veronica is a flawed character. It's why she's so compelling. But I think the show goes a long way towards making a crime drama about a complicated individual without making it blindly approve of the police. It's a show about crime and policing that isn't about the police. Veronica Mars represents what I think of as a significant step toward more progressive understandings of justice and crime, especially in the way that it repeatedly shows the failings of the police, how easily the position is corrupted, and by placing crime into larger social contexts. And it's more than just pointing out critiques of policing, actively trying to break our association of police and justice in a way that is very approachable, existing as an entertaining substitute for cop shows rather than a long thesis on socioeconomics. I mean, sometimes The Wire just feels like homework. While not abolitionist by any means, I think it's a far better option than almost anything else on TV, pointing out that the police are not an absolute good. Some good can come from police officers. It's not like they never catch a violent criminal or save people's lives. But it also doesn't mean that something is good just because the police do it, which is often the case on these cop shows. Cop shows are incredibly popular. They're everywhere because it's a proven formula. People love mysteries of the week dealing with crime, and Veronica Mars proves that there is a way to do that without totally capitulating to the police as the arbiters of truth, justice, and the American way.
And don't worry about the sheriff. He has a long and proud history of being wrong.
Giving into that police pressure would be easier, but it is, crucially, selling out. It means turning a blind eye to the problems that you don't have to deal with on a regular basis because of either your class or race or gender. It's the conventional path not because it's correct or right, but because of direct purges of left-wing thought in the 1950s. But things don't have to be this way. There were crime stories critical of our legal systems before, that showed the failures and blind spots of our justice system and how what is legal is not always what's right. And those stories can come back again. Just make more shows like Veronica Mars. Media has the powerful ability to shape the way we understand society around us, and it's important to remember that the conservative bent of police procedurals didn't happen in a vacuum. Before the crackdown on left-leaning creatives, even apolitical films could include some pretty strong expressions of class oppression.
These people have no nerves, no feeling. They're used to suffering, but they can't get used to paying.
You got a match, Colonel?
No, I don't smoke.
Colonel. Refuse me a match, will you?
But I haven't a match.
And those people didn't have the pennies to pay General Yang. Think it over.
That's From the General Died at Dawn, a film written by Clifford Odets about 13 years before he was dragged before HUAC for being a part of the Communist Party for less than a year. While he was never officially blacklisted, his career was tarnished forever afterwards. His story, along with the entire Red Scare that gripped Hollywood following World War II, is investigated in the documentary Red Hollywood, which is a great place to learn more about this era of American cinema. And you can stream it today on this video's sponsor, MUBI. MUBI is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. It is an incredible collection of high-quality cinema that you won't find anywhere else. Films that look at the world from a different perspective than our boring old cop shows. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there is always something new to discover. Each and every film is hand-selected by MUBI's team of curators. You can discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. You can try MUBI for free for 30 days at mubi.com/skipintro. That's mubi.com/skipintro for a whole month of great cinema for free. And thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you can share, like, subscribe to the channel that it's on, which is this channel. You can also support me on Patreon. Patreon is a great place to support these longer form research videos that take far too long to produce. On Patreon, you can get access to monthly mailbags, monthly TV roundups, and my second channel, Lil Skippies, which is for quick tapes. I mean, quick takes, not tapes, no tapes involved. It's also a place where you can watch these videos early and without ads, which is great because YouTube has just, there's no ads on. YouTube has gotten rid of ad blockers, I guess. So that's the way to watch without the ads. Anyways, I will talk at you next time. Happy 15th episode of Copaganda. I'm sure we're nearing the end of corrupt police.